Welcome to Transform Now, a podcast focused on intelligent automation and brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. On this program, we talk about how organizations globally are rethinking the way they operate, utilizing process orchestration and AI-enabled digital workers to free up humans to do the work that matters most. We also share insights and tips on how you can embrace this new way of working and unleash your full potential. Let's get into the show.
Hello everyone, Brad Hairston here. Welcome to Transform Now. My guest today is Dr. Robert Hunt, the Director of Global Theological Education at the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Dr. Hunt is going to be discussing with me an intriguing recent article that he authored titled, "Shall We Lose Our Humanity for AI?" Dr. Hunt, welcome. Why don't you take a second here and provide a broader introduction of yourself?
Brad, I'm happy to be with you, and I appreciate the question. My background is that for 20 years I lived overseas and was teaching in theological schools, but my focus was on what it means to be human in different religious traditions and in different cultural traditions. First in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and Singapore, talking about the Chinese and Malay cultural traditions primarily, and then in Austria for 7 years, where I taught in the university, and I was also the pastor of a church. And that's kind of the common thread of my career has been the question of what does it mean to be human in these different cultures and societies. More directly related to the university now, I'm an affiliate faculty member of the Simmons School of Education and Human Development. And there I teach a course in what it means to be human in different cultural settings with a particular focus on how modernity has changed that. And in the last 5 years or so, a focus on how the advent of the fourth industrial revolution or the fourth machine age and AI is influencing how we understand what it means to be human.
That's great. Robert, I've had several people from the academic world on this podcast over the last several years. I think you were the first one from the theological perspective, but I think it's so appropriate given the way things have evolved and this ongoing discussion about humanity and technology and how do they mix. And so I'm really glad to have you on today. You also mentioned that you are in Vienna right now writing a book on this same topic. And I can't think of a more serene place to get away and write a book like this. It must be hard, not wanting to go out and sightsee every minute. You must have to be very disciplined about staying on your book. But let me just start this whole discussion asking you, what inspired you to write this article about losing our humanity for AI? And why do you believe this message is important now?
I think it's important now because the advent of ChatGPT in 2022 really began to have an impact, a predictable impact, by the way, but a super impact on the way in which my students were beginning to think about their own humanity. And the more I see this rolling out, the more I read it in the news every day, the more it's clear that there is an impact on how we understand ourselves and what it means to be human. There was an op-ed piece in the last couple of days by David Brooks on this exact topic. I would take it back a little bit to a book that came out by Meg O'Gleiben titled God, Human, Animal, and Machine, in which she works from her religious background, although she's not religious now, and her interactions with AIs and robotics to bring up in a very journalistic sort of way, an autobiographical way, some of these questions. And as I read that book, I realized that it was a great book, given that it was 3 years prior to ChatGPT. But the questions have become much more urgent. And if I could put it very simply, we humans have been demystified by modernity. This is an idea that Charles Taylor takes up in his Secular Age. But we're beginning to think of AI as kind of mystical. And it needs to be demystified too. If we're going to maintain our humanity, we cannot misunderstand what it is that we relate to in a chatbot.
Robert, you say in the article that most people are asking if we're going to be intelligent enough to survive in the age of AI. But the real question is whether we will be human enough to survive in the AI age. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, the first time I heard this idea was in a conference at Southern Methodist University about 5.5 years ago. And it had to do with the then advances in artificial intelligence and was sponsored by our business school. And so we had business leaders asking the question of what does AI do? What's the impact it's going to have on us, and particularly on businesses? And one of the takeaways that I thought was interesting and which I've been thinking about for 5 or 6 years was a speaker from Stanford who said, if AI can do a lot of what humans do now, then we have to ask what humans can do.
Hmm.
And that, in fact, said very strongly, human resources may be the most important part of a company, not R&D and not marketing. So
Wow.
that led me to begin to ask a question that I didn't think was asked well enough at the conference. What does it mean to be human? And what makes us different from AI? So to get to the question I asked, we worry about, am I intelligent enough for an AI age? The problem with that question is it assumes that intelligence is the mark of our humanity.
Mm.
And the truth is, as I point out in that brief piece, if we think of ourselves as human because we're intelligent, then we've got some serious problems. And those problems happen on two sides. On one hand, it dehumanizes everybody that's not intelligent in the way we think of
Right.
intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Children, young children, people who have certain mental disabilities and incapacities, people who have dementia. If we've defined our humanity by intelligence, then already we've excluded a certain large number of humans. And at the
Mm.
same time, we begin to exclude ourselves from being human because these AIs are going to be more intelligent than us. And so we need a better definition of being human than just intelligent in the way that AI is intelligent.
Mm. There's a ton of substance to that, this idea that intelligence is not what makes us human.
Mhm.
So can you just talk about like what are some of the specific aspects of humanity that you believe AI will never be able to replicate?
I always hate to say never because everybody's going to work on this stuff. But I think there's a couple of things that we can lift up right off the bat. One is that as humans, we are embodied. We're not just a brain. We're a brain in a body.
Mm-hmm.
And as embodied humans, our sense of the reality of the world and our place in the reality of the world is quite different than a neural network that has been fed on human language, which is what a large language model is,
Mm-hmm.
or for that matter, any other form of data.
Right.
Um, we bring our bodies into the physical world and we experience it as embodied people. And it's that experience of being in a body is part of what makes us human. And it's something that we share, by the way, with the rest of the natural world. We share it with animals that are in bodies, all sorts. So we have connections there with one another as embodied creatures and with our relationship to the world. I think that's one thing that it seems will be extremely difficult for AI or for computers or robotics
Mm-hmm.
to simulate. A second thing that makes us particularly human is that we are humanized by each other. We don't learn to be human by taking in a bunch of stuff and then processing it. We learn to be human by interacting from the instant we are born. It is our interactions with our mother, with our father, with our siblings, with the
Right.
material world that shape who we are and who we understand ourselves to be as human. And those are, again, not reproducible in an LLM GPT. If you don't mind, I'll give a quick anecdotal example. A couple of 3 years ago, I lost the sight in my right eye due to an eye stroke. And it turns out it wasn't that big a deal. I mean, yeah, it's a big deal, but it's not that big a deal. People immediately ask, can you drive? Well, I'm an academic. I went off and read books about vision and perception. And one thing I learned is that, of
Uh-huh.
course, I can drive, because the way in which we humans learn depth perception is not because we happen to have two eyes that are spread apart. We learn it from the time we're 1 or 2 years old and we begin to manipulate objects in the environment. And we notice that when
Mm,
we push something away, it gets a little smaller. And we push it
right.
farther and it gets a little smaller. By the time you get to be an old adult like me, all of this is wired into the brain. It didn't come because an algorithm computes the parallax between my two eyes, which are hardly that far apart. It
Mm,
came about because I experienced the world as an embodied human being and observed what happened. By the way, the eyes being a little bit distant apart is very important for close perception. And so
mhm.
while I can drive perfectly, I am unreliable in pouring wine. But still, we can learn our way around that too. So I think it's going to be hard for any kind of AI to replace our sense of embodied relationships with one another and with reality that really are what build up the core of our humanity.
Mhm.
If I could put it
Mm,
another way, we make each other human. We make each other human.
mhm.
That's part of our job. And it's
Mhm.
part of the way we grow up.
Mm. That's well said. Robert, what else makes us human beyond our intelligence, that is?
To take this a little bit of a step further, I would say there's something else we possess. And again, Mega Gleiben points this out in a recent article in Wired magazine, and that's an imagination. We may not think about it, although we know it instinctively. Our brains
Mhm.
don't quit working. We are not responding to prompts when we're humans. Even when we
Mhm.
close our eyes, we dream. Even when we sleep, we dream. And this imaginative process that continually comes up with new ideas and new thoughts, we could say it's mysterious. And I think it is in a way mysterious still. There's still no full understanding of the neurology behind the relationship between brain and mind. But I think
Mhm.
imagination is an extremely important part of who we are. Large language model GPTs hallucinate, but they don't imagine. And it's really the difference between a creative artist and a 12-year-old adolescent boy who just makes stuff up. The creative artist imagines, the boy hallucinates. And so I think this is another key thing, the giving of humanity to one another that I've already mentioned. There's one other thing I should mention too, which is, and another great book, If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal by Justin Gregg. He talks about
Mhm.
the difference between human intelligence and animal intelligence. And he points out that as humans, we have developed the capacity to project ourselves into the future. And as we develop this capacity to project ourselves into the future, we begin to plan ahead. We begin to think about the consequences of our action. Now, a downside of this is that we gain the capacity to imagine our own death. And this can be extremely frightening, but it can also lead us to ask questions about transcendence. And what does it
Mhm.
mean to be beyond ourselves, beyond the embodied self that is going to die? And here's one of the reasons I got very interested in this being human in an AI age was reading the work of Ray Kurzweil, and in particular, his daughter Amy's kind of autobiographical work, a graphic novel. Because Kurzweil and many others in this field is constantly thinking about what he calls transhumanity, about what does it mean to transcend ourselves.
Mhm.
Now, the interesting thing is Kurzweil comes from a rather secular Jewish background. His parents came from Vienna, where I am. That's one of my
Mhm.
excuses for being here. But he doesn't bring to his concept of transhumanity, he does not bring a particularly religious vision.
Mhm.
And yet, much of the wisdom of humanity in asking this idea of what does it mean that we could transcend ourselves is found in our religions. All our
Mhm.
religions deal with transcendence. And I think this is where, as far as we know, we humans are the only creatures that ask what is the transcendent framework within which my life and the life of this world is lived? And how should I relate to it positively? I think this is a critical question. I note that another writer that I like a lot, Marcel Gleisner, has just written a book about this. He's got his own perspectives, which I think are useful. But one of the things he points out is we create climate change, but we can also imagine, because we can imagine the future,
Hmm.
we can imagine a transcendent future, that we become uniquely human because we are willing to engage in changing the things that we are creating for the benefit of a future us that doesn't exist, that's contained in our grandchildren and great grandchildren, and maybe even the whole of the earth, animals and plants and stuff. We can rise above just my mere humanity interacting with other humans and begin to say, what's the bigger framework and how do I preserve it for the benefit of all life? That is very human.
Right. You definitely touched on spirituality in your article as
Right.
a key aspect of humanity that AI really cannot replicate or cannot even attempt to replicate. Now,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier, people are still going to try,
Right.
and that certainly does seem to be the trend. I've noticed as Gen AI progresses, they're trying to make it more emotionally intelligent, more empathetic,
Right.
using the right words and
Mhm.
so forth that would potentially be comforting to a child that's having a bad day
Right.
at school or what have you.
Sure.
But the question still comes back, do we really want a robot comforting a child that's having a bad day at school, or do we want a human? I think we would agree that a human is gonna be optimal every time.
Yeah. One of the interesting takeaways from the conference 5.5 years ago, just beginning to be fulfilled, is that it's quite possible that surgeons will be replaced by robots. And I had noticed an announcement 2 days ago, a robotic
Mhm.
oral surgeon has already been tested. And I've had a few surgeries in the last 3 or 4 years. And I can tell you that I met the surgeon right before I went under, and that's kind of the last time I saw him. So I don't care if it's a robot or not. But when I come out of anesthesia, I want to see a human face. And it may well be that we'll have human nurses a lot longer than we'll have human surgeons. And I think in times of stress, we want a human. And to your point, and I quite agree with you, yes, OpenAI has announced a new, better large language model that can supposedly relate to empathy. This is just in the last couple of days.
Mhm.
And I will say, I have a student, a former student, he's now graduated with his doctorate, who's working on AI as a spiritual director.
Hmm.
But this said, there is more to this idea of a human spirit in relationship to transcendence and how we think of that
Right.
as just saying the right words. Yes, we may train a AI to say the right words, but it's not going to be the same thing as hearing them come from a warm blooded human like us. If it's a necessary second best, okay, but it's not going to be the same thing.
Right. This reminds me of one of the demos I recently saw online, one of the Gen AI models that now you can show your phone like a pointed at your dog and it can start talking to your dog and it, admiring how cute it is and talking like a human
Hmm.
at your dog. And while that's fascinating that it can do that, I would
Hmm.
rather a human do that toward my dog than my phone. It's not meaningful. I don't see the value of that or how that's advantageous to a human appreciating my dog. I'm a huge proponent of AI. So many different ways that companies and technologists are trying to put it to use that are just not appropriate and don't appreciate our humanity in the way that you're describing it. I think you have a very profound perspective on this.
Well,
Robert, as a educator, let me ask you, how can our educational systems better incorporate the humanities and theology and the arts to foster humanity?
I think that's a great question, Brad, and it's one that's top of the mind for many of us right now. One thing we can do is we can go back a little ways. The origin of the university was in two places, and really the education system was in two places. One of these was the first universities were professional schools, and the
Hmm.
three professions were theology, medicine, and law. Basically, If you ran a country, you were a king or a duke or a pope or anybody, then you needed some experts in these areas. And they went to universities to gain that expertise. So there were creators of experts, of technicians. We don't think of theology as a technical field right now, but in many ways it was, and it always has been. You have to know the right doctrine and dogma in order to enforce what the church teaches. But the real origin of the modern university happens, if I'm not mistaken, in Venice and in northern Italy, when, beginning with someone like Machiavelli, there's an effort, and this would be the origin of the humanities or the humanists, there's an effort to realize that for someone to be a leader, they need to understand the humans that they lead. And the way in which you understand the humans that you lead is by reading works about humanity by humans. So you read biography, you read history, you read literature, because locked in all of our literature are stories about what it means to be a human. And you look and learn about art, because all of our art, our myths, our religions, all these are
Mm.
expressions of our humanity. And so the modern university, the liberal arts university, begins with the idea that leaders have to be trained on being human and understanding humans. So one of the obvious things is we need to keep our schools from becoming technical schools. We need
Yep.
to go right back to the beginning, and this at first grade, and think about the fact that our ultimate job in education is creating humans
Mm.
and how
Yep.
we do that. Now, these humans have to have some skills. Absolutely. They've got to learn to read. They've got to learn to write. They've got to learn to do math. A good friend of mine taught first grade for many, many, many years at the Vienna International School. And I asked her, what do you do when you teach first graders? And she said, for the first 6 weeks, we have to teach them how to be humans, how to line up their boots at the door, how to not poke each other and prod each other, how to answer questions, how to be civil. They're creatures who've grown up in a very small social environment. Now they need to be in a much bigger social environment, and how to be human with each other. That's what you're teaching first graders. That's the
Mm.
basis on which all the other learning takes place.
Yeah.
And we can't forget that. We cannot become technical schools, vocational schools, and forget the part of us that needs to know how it means to be human. So I think this is the first thing. We need to recover the liberal arts and understand that as they were once important for a relative elite that were going to be leaders, political leaders primarily, they're
Mhm.
now relevant to everybody who forms any kind of position in a community of humans, whether it's a leader or just being a community member. We'll have to recover that. And we have to realize that the way in which we learn how to be human is by reading novels, reading
Mhm.
history and what happened to humans. It's attending to the fine arts, theater, drama, movies, science fiction, for heaven's sake, all of that. I think that's the first thing. The second thing I'll mention is the fine arts, because the sculpture, painting, all of these things are ways in which humans both cultivate their relationship to their own imagination and their expression, but they are also ways in which we communicate with one another and convey ideas that cannot be conveyed in any other way. So if I
Mhm.
go into any Vienna's many, many museums, which I haven't even seen all of them, and I lived here for a long time, what I'm seeing hanging on the walls is an expression of someone's unique humanity and vision of humanity. And that teaches me something about myself. To the extent that I respond to it, I know, oh, okay, I'm seeing something here that I didn't know before. And I could name the paintings that capture the moment of an age, or capture what it's like to be 12 years old, or capture what it's like to feel alone. And so the fine arts in this sense are absolutely critical to this cultivation of our humanity. And then the third thing is, you mentioned theology. And
Mm.
I teach in a Christian theological school, but it happens that I teach about non-Christian religions primarily. I think that we need, in a systematic way, and we live in a post-religious age, let's just be honest about that. But we still, in a systematic way, need to bring to students the questions of transcendence. And what is the human spirit that transcends the human body? And have them wrestle with those questions using whatever resources we can make available to them, philosophical or religious. we have this unique capacity to imagine that which is bigger than us and even our whole species and even our whole planet and even our whole universe. It's a fabulous ability, but it has to be cultivated. Traditionally, that's what theology schools did or philosophy did. And we
Hmm.
still have to keep that up.
Okay. Robert, let me ask you about this whole area of human to human interactions. There's a lot of intertwining of AI in that area to make those better, not to replace them, but to enhance them. What's your perspective on how AI can actually be used in a positive manner there?
Let me suggest a couple of things, and they're going to almost seem trivial. One thing that AI can do is it allows us to enter into a virtual world where we can experiment with different ways of being human and seeing what happens. So it can create a safe space for us to ask questions, try things out, and have a model that is trained on human interactions, give us an idea of what works and what doesn't work in a safe space. So I think this can be part of it. They've just done a couple of studies that show that if you're polite to your chatbot, you get better answers. Now, they're not quite sure why, but I would argue that all of our interactions, language interactions, are setting the kind of habits that we have for human interaction. If we're rude to Siri and Alexa, and that's a very low level AI, by the way. If we're rude to Siri and Alexa, we're likely to be rude to other people. If we're rude to ChatGPT or Perplexity or to Claude or to Llama 3, then the odds are we're practicing to be rude with our fellow humans. So,
Mm.
at the very least, as we interact with these AIs, we can practice being better people than we are. And I think it'd actually be quite good if the AIs were programmed to just say, I don't answer to rude questions. We might learn something, you know? Uh,
Yeah. I can tell you, my wife and I have definitely expressed frustration at Alexa when she or when it
yeah,
doesn't give us the right answer. And occasionally it will come back and apologize and
yeah,
explain why she gave us the wrong answer and she'll do better next
yeah.
time,
Well,
whatever. So we're definitely guilty of that.
she'll get better and better, but I have to say she is pretty frustrating. I mean, it's definitely artificial, but I sometimes wonder how intelligent.
It's
Um,
exactly. You said low level AIs, and I agree with that. That's
yeah,
about the lowest level that you
uh,
can get.
you can get. But I do think that one of the positive things is that AI can help us ask a lot of questions that we may have something about. We can
Hmm.
practice interacting with a language model. I try to keep up my German and my Malay,
Hmm.
and all of the chatbots are terrific for having a conversation in a language because you have to make yourself understood. They can answer back. This is the kind of thing that I'm thinking of the language learning technology over the last 20 years. It used to be the cassettes repeated something in your ear, and then
Hmm.
you said it and you hoped you got it right. Some of the very early computer-based language models were smart enough to listen to your intonation and accent and compare it to a database and see if it sounded roughly correct. That
Mm.
was enormously frustrating. But in the lab outside of the language class, then here's another whole possibility. And or I would say, even in an academic environment, if you've got 10 ideas you want to toss around for a paper, and we heard this from our students at SMU, by the way, they use ChatGPT as a conversation partner.
Hmm.
They can't get to the professor all the time, and professors don't always answer their email. So if they've
Right.
got an idea, they chat with ChatGPT about it and see what it thinks.
I want to ask you one final question here as we
Sure.
wrap up today. What practical steps can individuals and communities take to recover and preserve our humanity in the AI age?
That's a great question. I'm going to say that the first thing is that we need to put a greater emphasis on person to person physical interaction.
Hmm.
And adjacent to that would be real time interaction that is mediated through Zoom or through other platforms like that. Both of these are terrifically important. I think the real-time in-person interaction is absolutely critical. And whatever institution we're in, we need to make that part of the way our institutions work and not get lost behind our screens. But even when it's necessary to use screens, then I think we need to try to make this real time, not asynchronous, but synchronous interactions where we use all of the senses that we have to listen to voices and look at faces and get an idea of what's going on. And I want to add, both of these things are critical because
Mhm.
one of the things where AI is super helpful as it runs in the background of mediating many of these kinds of interactions is that it allows people that really cannot easily move into a public space to have more human interactions. These are, mediated through the internet or whatever. But the
Mhm.
point is to let AI mediate the human interactions, not replace them. And I would say, whatever our institution is, whether it's a university, whether it's a church, that we foster the human to human relations that are physically present, use all of our physical embodiment. Those are going to be the steps that keep us human. If anything does, that will be what does it.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I really want to thank you for joining the podcast, Robert. Your perspective on how we preserve and cultivate our humanity in this era of AI is definitely very intriguing. And I look forward to your book on this topic as well. So I wish you the best as you continue your work on it there in the city of music. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Brad. I appreciate it. It was nice to have a chance to think about some of these things with a fellow human being.
Thank you for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C Blue Prism. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of intelligent automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.